So imagine you check the weather app on your phone.
Right?
You see a little cloud icon, maybe a percentage chance of rain, and you grab an umbrella.
Right, just a normal day.
Exactly. But imagine looking down at your screen and the forecast calls for a 100% chance of literal fire and ice falling from the sky. I mean, no umbrella is going to help you with that.
No, definitely not. I mean, it would completely violate your understanding of how the natural world operates. You would just be looking at the absolute collapse of predictability.
Yeah, total chaos. So welcome to another deep dive. Today, our mission is to pull you into a massive stack of sources we've compiled: historical commentaries, psychological analyses, and structural literary reviews.
And they are all centered on a single ancient text, which is Exodus chapter 9.
Right. Specifically, the seventh plague of Egypt, the plague of hail.
Yeah, and if you are anticipating the sanitized childhood Sunday school version of this narrative, you should probably adjust your expectations. We are completely bypassing that.
Oh, entirely. The sources reveal a text that is operating on a highly sophisticated level.
Yeah.
I mean, beneath the surface of a story about bad weather, we are looking at a masterclass in ancient cognitive biases.
A literal war between gods, too.
Yes, and a hidden literary architecture that completely reframes the concepts of human stubbornness and free will. But to understand any of that, we have to start with the physical event itself.
Right, because before we can analyze the psychology of the people who suffered through it, we really need to understand the unprecedented nature of the strike.
So let's unpack this. The vocabulary the ancient Hebrew authors chose here is intensely specific, isn't it?
It is, yeah. The text describes the seventh plague as hail mingled with fire. But the sources point out the actual Hebrew phrases used, esh methaleket or vatahelek esh aretza.
Okay, what does that actually mean?
Well, it does not mean lightning flashing up in the clouds. It translates to fire enfolding itself or fire darting and walking down to the ground.
Fire walking on the earth. I mean, that is a terrifying visual.
It really is. The physical description we get from the commentaries is this chaotic, relentless mixture of lightning and ice with fire literally running along the ground.
Wow.
And you have to place this within its geographical context. I mean, Egypt is a desert climate.
Right. Hail of any kind is incredibly rare.
Exactly. So a storm of this magnitude, combining massive ice projectiles with ground-level fire, was basically an impossibility. It was entirely outside their historical record.
And the destruction was just total.
Mm.
The sources highlight a very specific fourfold progression of the devastation.
Yeah, the text says it hit the humans, it hit the beasts, it hit the herbs of the field.
Wait, the Hebrew word used there is asev, right?
Yes, isev,
Yeah.
and it shattered the trees. The significance of that word isev is that it represents the foundational floor of their agricultural food chain.
So like the grass and the basic plant life.
Right, the grazing material. The basic sustenance for whatever life might somehow survive the initial impact. I mean, everything left outside wasn't just damaged, it was pulverized.
Which is insane. But the scale of that destruction points to the underlying purpose of the storm. Because the psychological and historical analyses we are drawing from argue that this wasn't simply a natural disaster.
No, not at all. It wasn't intended to cause indiscriminate damage. It was a precision-engineered theological strike.
Right, because the ancient Egyptian worldview was deeply polytheistic. But specifically, their deities were tied to the functions of nature. They worshipped the created order.
Exactly. They relied entirely on the predictability of the Nile, the predictability of the sun. So you have Nut, the goddess of the sky.
Who should be in control of the weather overhead.
Right. And Osiris, the god of crops and fertility. Then Set, who is the god of storms and chaos.
So every element of this specific weather event was basically designed to cross-examine those exact deities.
Yes, and publicly expose them as frauds.
You know, the analogy that kept coming to my mind as I read through the historical commentaries was a modern cyber attack.
Oh, that's a great way to think about it.
Right. Think about a rogue hacker infiltrating the highly secured internal servers of a massive tech conglomerate. The hacker doesn't just want to steal data or crash the website. They want to humiliate the company.
They want to make a public point.
Exactly. They broadcast a message on the company's own homepage to prove to the entire world that this elite, multi-million-dollar cybersecurity department is completely useless. Yahweh was essentially hacking the Egyptian operating system.
I love that analogy. And the text actually leans into that hacking concept through its auditory description.
Oh, right, the thunder.
Yeah. The Hebrew word used for the thunder in this passage is qualot. It literally translates to voices.
Voices, not just a rumble.
Right. To the ancient Egyptians standing in their fields, they weren't perceiving random atmospheric noise. They were hearing the literal, terrifying voices of a foreign superior deity.
Dominating their own gods on their home turf.
Exactly.
That auditory detail really forces us to look at the human element here. We have this overwhelming, system-breaking cosmic storm. But this brings us to a massive psychological puzzle in the text.
It's one of the most fascinating parts of the narrative, honestly.
Yeah, because for the first time in all the plagues, Moses actually provides the Egyptians with an explicit warning and a way to escape. He tells them the storm is coming tomorrow, and he explicitly says, your servants and your livestock inside.
Do not leave them in the field.
Right. But a significant portion of the population completely ignored the warning. They just stayed in the field, knowing what Moses had predicted.
It seems baffling at first glance.
Yeah, I had a really hard time buying this from the psychological sources. I mean, it's one thing to say human beings are generally optimistic. It's another to say they're explicitly warned about a supernatural firestorm by a guy who has already delivered 6 devastating plagues.
And they hear the warning and they just shrug it off.
Exactly. They say, no, I think I'll go ahead and stay outside today. Are the structural analyses really claiming the Egyptian citizens were just that foolish?
Well, the analyses don't actually view them as foolish. They view them as psychologically and economically trapped.
Trapped.
You have to look at the mechanics of what the sources call optimism bias and precedent discounting.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, we assume people act rationally in a crisis, but the human brain is actually wired to avoid overwhelming stress by relying on past patterns. Think about the previous 6 plagues from an Egyptian farmer's perspective.
Well, the Nile turned to blood, but eventually it cleared up.
Right. The frogs invaded the land, but then the frogs died and they swept them away. They endured the crisis and the baseline of their lives returned.
I see. So the human mind has this deep-seated, almost pathological assumption that tomorrow will ultimately look like yesterday.
Exactly. They took their past precedent. We survived the gnats, we survived the flies, and their brains actively discounted the threat of a localized apocalyptic weather event.
Because it had never happened before.
Right. It was too extreme to process.
So they're doing mental gymnastics to justify ignoring the meteorologist. But there is a massive economic factor the sources bring up that makes this even more complex.
Oh, the timing is crucial. The timeline of the storm. The text specifically notes the agricultural calendar.
Right, the flax and the barley.
Yeah, this event occurred when the flax and the barley were in the bud or the head. That means those 2 vital crops were fully mature and ready for immediate harvest.
But the wheat and the spelt were spared because they ripened later in the season.
Exactly. So think about the economic reality. To heed the warning and pull your servants and your animals out of the fields means you are completely halting the harvest of your most vulnerable crops.
It was a brutal financial calculation.
Absolutely. Bringing everyone inside means losing crucial labor hours. It means leaving the mature barley exposed to rot or predators. For an agrarian society, halting a harvest isn't just an inconvenience.
It risks absolute economic ruin and starvation.
Right. So they weighed the invisible threat of a foreign god against the very visible, immediate threat of bankruptcy. And many of them just chose to risk the storm.
Which is tragic because we actually have independent corroboration that this massive agricultural wipeout happened.
The archaeological and historical evidence is really compelling here.
It is. The sources cite the Ipuwer Papyrus, which is this ancient Egyptian document lamenting the total collapse of their society. It specifically describes fire mingling with destruction and the lower classes starving because the crops are gone.
And it goes beyond just texts. The commentaries also point to archaeological digs at El Daba.
The site of the ancient capital, right?
Yes, by Ramesses. The sediment there reveals specific pollen layers showing an abrupt, massive cessation of mature crop pollen during this era.
Wow. So the agriculture was literally pulverized into the dirt.
The physical evidence matches the textual claim of total economic catastrophe perfectly, but the psychological analyses layer on one more element here, which is sociological pressure.
Right, the state cult.
Yeah. In ancient Egypt, your entire identity and social status were intrinsically tied to the state cult. Pharaoh wasn't just a king.
He was considered a living god.
Exactly. The divine guarantor of Ma'at, or cosmic order. Which means if you are a commoner and you pack up your animals and run inside because Moses told you to,
You are publicly declaring that Pharaoh is powerless to protect you.
yes, it is basically theological treason. You are cramming your livestock into your living room and inviting the mockery of your neighbors who stayed out in the fields, trusting their divine king.
Wow. So the people in the fields were choosing the comfort of social conformity and economic momentum over acknowledging a terrifying new reality.
They were completely boxed in by their own society.
And while the commoners are out in the fields making those fatal calculations, the person responsible for the entire crisis is locked in his palace.
Pharaoh himself.
Right. And the psychological weight of those voices finally breaks Pharaoh. He calls Moses in, and we get this moment that looks, on the surface, like a massive breakthrough. But the sources label it the anatomy of a hollow apology.
It's a really fascinating psychological study. The phrasing the ancient authors use for Pharaoh's concession is so revealing. He says to Moses, "I have sinned this time."
Yes, I have sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are the wicked ones.
That phrase, "this time," is doing an incredible amount of heavy lifting.
It really is. He is treating this as an isolated incident. I mean, he completely glosses over his administration's systemic slavery, the mandated execution of innocent infants, the oppression of an entire ethnic group.
Like that was all just fine.
Right. He acts as if all of that was just standard operating procedure. But this particular weather event is where he finally crossed a moral line.
Well, the theological and psychological commentaries draw a very sharp distinction here between two concepts, attrition and contrition.
Okay, let's clarify those for the listener.
So contrition is genuine, internal brokenness over the moral weight of your actions. It is a fundamental shift in character.
You actually realize you were wrong.
Exactly. Attrition, on the other hand, is simply panic. You weren't sorry for what you did. You were just terrified of the punishment you were receiving.
And Pharaoh is experiencing peak attrition.
Absolutely. He just wants the agonizing Qawat, those voices of the storm, to stop shattering his kingdom.
And the sources draw a brilliant visual contrast here
Mm-hmm.
between Pharaoh's attrition and Moses' posture. Because Pharaoh is cowering inside, begging for relief.
But Moses handles it completely differently.
Right. He tells Pharaoh he will stop the storm, but he doesn't pray in the palace. He walks out of the city directly into the middle of this unprecedented, lethal storm of fire and ice.
Completely untouched.
Untouched. And the text says he spreads his palms to the sky. The Hebrew word is paras. What does the linguistic analysis say about paras?
It's vital. It implies spreading open, pure palms of petition. It is the physical manifestation of vulnerability and total alignment with the divine will.
As opposed to a closed, angry fist.
Exactly. The open palms of submission stand in stark relief against the closed, hardened heart of the Egyptian ruler.
It's such a cinematic moment. Moses walks into the chaos with open hands, the storm ceases, the sky is clear, and the immediate threat vanishes.
And what happens next?
The very moment the pressure is off, Pharaoh reverses course, hardens his heart, and continues the oppression. Which makes me wonder, looking at Pharaoh in that specific moment of terror when the hail is literally tearing his nation apart, is he just a calculating, manipulative politician playing a game with Moses?
Or does he genuinely believe his own apology in that split second?
Exactly. Does he mean it?
The psychological analyses suggest he actually likely believed it in the moment. You see, crisis creates a temporary state of clarity driven by pure survival instinct.
So the fear makes him sincere, temporarily.
Yes, but that is the core of the human condition the text is exposing here. The true test of a changed mind, the ultimate proof of repentance, is never what a person does when their back is against the wall and the thunder is crashing.
Because anyone will make a sweeping moral promise in a foxhole.
Precisely. The real metric of change is what you do when the threat is removed, the skies are clear, and you have the power to return to your old habits.
And Pharaoh failed the test of the clear sky.
He absolutely did.
Now, here is where things get really interesting. What the structural literary sources point out that completely blew my mind is that Pharaoh's broken promise here isn't just a fascinating character flaw.
No, it's structurally foundational.
Right. This specific moment of fake apology and his return to stubbornness actually serves as the load-bearing wall for the entire architecture of the ancient text.
We have to look at how scholars traditionally map the narrative of the 10 plagues. Usually the plagues are divided into 3 groups of 3, followed by the final plague of the firstborn.
So, blood, frogs, gnats, then flies, livestock, boils, then hail, locusts, darkness.
Right, a 3-3-3-1 structure. And that model is usually based on the patterns of who gives the warning and where the warning takes place.
But the literary analyses in our stack of sources propose a second, simultaneous structural paradigm operating beneath the text, an overlay of a 7-3 division.
And in this 7-3 model, the 7th plague, the hail, is the grand finale of the first major sequence.
Okay, why does that matter?
Well, The sources argue that plagues 1 through 7 have a very specific, stated mission, and that is to educate the Egyptians. The goal is to dismantle their worldview and show Pharaoh and his citizens the absolute sovereignty of Yahweh.
But plagues 8 through 10 have a totally different audience and a totally different mission. They're explicitly designed to educate the Israelites.
Yes. The text actually announces this pivot. The mission shifts to creating a profound, terrifying narrative of deliverance that the Israelites are commanded to recount to their children and grandchildren for generations.
And that structural pivot perfectly explains the theology of the hardening of the heart, which is something that has always sparked massive debate.
Oh, it's a huge point of theological contention.
Yeah, because if you read carefully in the first group of plagues, the text consistently states that Pharaoh hardens his own heart.
He is the active agent of his own stubbornness.
Right. Moses gives him multiple chances, the pressure is applied, and Pharaoh actively digs his heels in. But right after the hail, starting with the 8th plague of locusts, the verb completely shifts. The text says God hardens Pharaoh's heart.
It is a fundamental shift in agency, and to be clear, we are simply reporting how the ancient source texts and their authors framed this theology of free will and divine intervention.
Of course. But according to their literary structure, the warning given by Moses right before the hail is entirely unique.
It is. Moses tells Pharaoh that God is sending all these plagues upon your heart.
Upon your heart. So the storm wasn't just targeting the crops, it was targeting his internal will.
Exactly. Pharaoh's habitual, self-willed intransigence, his constant precedent discounting, his fake apologies, his attrition, it has all hardened to the point of becoming his permanent destiny.
Wow.
The structural analyses argue that after the hail, Pharaoh has actually lost his free will to release the Israelites. He is no longer an active participant making choices.
He is now being used purely as an instrument to demonstrate power to the next generation.
Right.
It functions exactly like a masterfully paced movie script. Think about a 3-act thriller. The first 2 acts, which map onto plagues 1 through 7, operate like a hostage negotiation.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The villain is barricaded in the building, the negotiator is on the radio, and the villain genuinely possesses the agency and the power to surrender. He can walk out with his hands up at any time.
But he doesn't.
Right. And once the script hits the 3rd act, plagues 8 through 10, it ceases to be a negotiation. The villain has entirely lost his agency. The director is now simply moving him around as a prop to drive the explosive finale and teach the audience a lesson.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. And the literary motifs of those final 3 plagues heavily reinforce that loss of agency.
How so?
Well, once Pharaoh's free will is gone, the narrative is completely dominated by themes of darkness and departure. I mean, the 8th plague of locusts is so severe it literally darkens the sky.
The 9th plague is a suffocating, literal darkness that lasts for days.
Right. And the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, happens at midnight. The 7th plague of hail was really the final exam for Pharaoh's heart. He was given an explicit warning, a chance to shelter, a chance to demonstrate contrition.
But he failed the exam, and the lights slowly go out on his kingdom.
Yeah, it's incredibly bleak.
The density of the information we've unpacked from these sources is just staggering. We are looking at a narrative that simultaneously operates as a cosmic, targeted takedown of the Egyptian weather gods.
It functions as a surprisingly modern psychological case study, too. I mean, we've got optimism bias, precedent discounting, and the overwhelming power of economic anxiety.
And underneath all of that, it is a highly structured literary masterpiece defining the exact tipping point where human stubbornness costs a person their free will.
Which really brings the entire analysis right back to the listener.
It does.
Because it is incredibly easy to sit comfortably in the modern era, look back at ancient history, and judge Pharaoh and the Egyptian citizens, we confidently assume we would have brought our livestock inside.
Oh, of course we do.
We assume we would have recognized the warning signs and acted rationally. But the underlying psychology of human nature hasn't shifted at all. We all face moments where our pride, our deep economic investments, or just the fear of looking foolish in front of our peers tempts us to ignore undeniable warnings.
And that leaves you with something profound to mull over, long after this deep dive ends. Think back to that concept of precedent discounting.
It's so pervasive.
That deeply ingrained psychological urge to assume tomorrow will be just like yesterday, simply because you survived the past. So what modern impending storms in your own life Your career or your relationships? Are you currently ignoring or downplaying?
You look at the data, you hear the warning, but you brush it off.
Because the disaster hasn't happened to you yet, you tell yourself it'll be fine. You're leaving your life out in the field because the sky happens to be clear right now.
Yeah.
What warning are you refusing to heed just because the structural integrity of your life hasn't snapped yet? Take a good look at the horizon.